Thank you, everyone. This is the 28th virtual roundtable on measuring corruption, part of this series that started in 2022. So we are in our third year and going pretty strong. Today we have a presentation by Kristýna Bašná, who has a really brilliant research project already in the final stages, as I believe. And I'm very excited to learn more about it and to have her answer some of the questions that have been burning inside me since she mentioned the topic that she was working on. Before I invite her to introduce herself and I give her the floor, I would like to go over very quickly through some of the rules, basically, especially for those of you who are joining for the first time, although the majority of you have already been here before. So these roundtables are advertised as being about 45 minutes of discussion, followed up by an open floor Q&A round of another 45 minutes for a total of 90 minutes. We will keep to that general time of 90 minutes. However, as I already discussed with Kristýna in the past, rather than keeping the Q&A for the very end, if you have any questions or comments or anything that you would like to share about the presentation at any moment, please do so. So if you raise your hand on the camera, or you click the raising hand icon, then I will invite you to unmute yourself and add your question or make your comments. Otherwise, I will ask you to please keep your microphone off, as to not to disturb Kristýna's presentation. Other than that, you will not really hear much from me. Well, I will also be asking some questions and interrupting Kristýna unfairly throughout her presentation, so I apologize in advance for that. And yeah, so the point of this is to be able to hold kind of like a more friendly conversation, right, rather than having only a lecture form of presentation, right? So that's it from my side. Kristýna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here our project and for the invite to be able to be here. I'll share my screen now and wait a sec. Okay, can you hear? Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I don't see it in full screen yet, but I can see your
yeah,
PowerPoint.
now it should be. It should be in full screen. Okay, good. Thank you. So just to tell you a little bit about the project, it's a pretty new innovative project we did in the Czech Republic, because there hasn't been so far any similar project that would try to measure corruption in the middle area, so not on a completely societal level, not on the very low level among common people, but in the middle, that means among different sectors. So I'll be very happy to hear your thoughts and to hear your feedback, because we have it as a pilot project that we want to replicate every 5 years to see how the things are developing in the sector. So first, a little bit about me, so that you know who you're speaking to. I'm Kristýna Bašná. I work as a senior researcher at the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. And I have been visiting around a bit and studying around mostly Europe, which was really helpful for me to understand the differences, especially in corruption, as corruption is very dependent on the society where you measure it. So that was really helpful also to understand how to do this project in the Czech Republic. I'm also core team member of the European Social Survey, which I'm not sure everyone knows what it is. It's a large cross-national survey that measures values and different topics in Europe and Israel. And I'm part of that already for 9 years. So we do every 2 years, we do a large cross-national survey. which also helped me to understand how to do a survey, which was a huge part of this project. And my topics of interest are corruption measurement, inequalities, and corruption post-communist countries. I'm very interested in comparing corruption and corruption norms across different cultures. And now about the project. The name of the project was called Corruption in Selected Sectors in the Czech Republic and Possibilities of its Reduction. It ran for 3 years, so it already ended in December. So now we have all the results and all the outcomes that we wanted to have. But today I'm going to present just the methodology. I'm not going to talk about the results because that would be for 10 days because we have so much data that that's really a lot. We also need to think about what to do now with them and how to proceed further. The project was funded by the Technology Agency of the Czech Republic. That's the national agency that funds projects that want to be somehow applied to public or private sector. The aim was to understand the different forms and reasons behind corruption in 6 selected sectors. We did it in cooperation with the Ministry of Justice. So we selected 6 sectors that were the most important for the Ministry of Justice. That meant that, for example, there has been no data at all in these sectors about corruption. So, or the sectors where they knew there is a lot of corruption, so they wanted to find ways how to fight better against it. So we wanted to propose specific policies to effectively fight corruption in these sectors. We were small core research team. I'm very happy to see that one of our researchers is present in this call. So it was me, Radim Bureš, Dalibor Fadrny, who was from the Ministry of Justice, and Jaroslava Pospíšová from our institute. Plus we have another person from the Ministry of Justice, František Kučera, who helped us. And of course, we had another team members who helped with the survey, with interviews and stuff. The whole project was basically done in cooperation with the ministry. So it was a very interesting project to somehow work with the public sector, but to understand what the public sector wants, but still be able to do it scientifically correctly. We had lots of back and forth to find some sort of balance between the 2 areas and to be able to do this project with results that would be helpful in the public sector, but also in the academic sector. After loads and loads of discussions, we decided to do quite elaborate methodological approach and to do several methods to understand corruption in the different sectors and then to triangulate the results. So we did qualitative and quantitative analysis. We had 4 different methods, which I'm going to talk about later. And the 6 sectors that were important for the Ministry of Justice were education, research, public procurement, healthcare, debt collection, which is, I understand, pretty specific to the Czech Republic, that it's not such a huge issue in other countries, and construction, spatial planning, and sport, which is usually, the rest of them are usually a big deal in the corruption area. As I said, the cooperation with the Ministry of Justice was quite strong, so we were able to actually use the results for quite an important documents in the Czech government. So we had the government concept for combating corruption for the years 23 to 26 and the action plan for combating corruption, which we were able to use the results for this. And for the future, there are also plans to use the results for the next action plans for combating corruption. And also the project is part of the reform of the National Recovery Plan of the Czech Republic, because there is a component on data collection and analysis of corruption. So now we move to the actual methodology of the project. So for us, it was a challenge, of course, because corruption is a very sensitive topic. So we needed to make sure that we have correct data. Another huge challenge was the definition of corruption. I'm going to talk about this in detail later, because I didn't accept this to be such a huge challenge. I thought that most people understand, at least in the Czech Republic, corruption similarly, but this was really not the case. And also we had basically no prior research in the Czech Republic in the selected sectors. In some of them, there was some research. There's also the cross-national research that is done by the European Commission or Transparency International or other institutions, but there was nothing that would go really deeply into the issues we have in the Czech Republic. And as I said, we decided to do different methods to find out about the level of corruption and the specific forms. We did a literature review, which I'm not going to talk about very much because that was a standard literature review. We did interviews, we did a survey, and at the end we had workshops which were in a way of focus groups. Sorry?
No, sorry about that. That was someone else.
Okay. And after that, we triangulated the results to make sure that we have the same responses from each of these methods that would make sense somehow in total. So the first method we used was interviews, and we selected experts in each sector. We had about 4 to 6 experts, 31 in total. And these experts were selected we had targeted selections because we needed really to make sure that we would cover all the parameters of the population in each sector. So we didn't want to leave out any of the areas that would be important. Also because we used the results of the interviews as a basis for the development of the questionnaire. So the main focus was to understand how these experts perceive corruption in the sector. We didn't actually ask them on their own experience of corruption. We were interested on the whole wide sector. We wanted to know what they think the problems are in the sectors, what are the different forms of corruption in these sectors, because in each sector there are really different corruption forms, and some of them are not known to the regular population. You have to have really experts who understand the specifics of the sector. They also told us about the problematic areas, where are the red flags, how to find them, and also the ideas for effective anti-corruption measures. And these interviews, as you can see here, this is the table of the interviewees. So we had different categories in each sector, and we tried to fill all of them to make sure that we have use of each type of expert. And the views were really important to us to develop the questionnaire, which then we used in the survey. Because without them, we would have loads of forms of corruption which would be missing in each sector. And then we did a survey, which was the core method for our project. We didn't do a representative survey, because that's not possible in the methodology or in the sectoral level that we focused on. And we did online data collection because that was, in our view, the best way to do it, because we had improved anonymity. and people were more open to fill out the questionnaire. And we hoped that would lead also to more truthful responses. In each sector, we identified different types of respondents. We focused on insiders. So we wanted to cover only those people that are in touch with the sector and those who actually know something about it and were able to actually encounter corruption in the sector. Because usually the surveys are trying to be representative, but as only a low fragment of regular people are actually in touch with the sector, and then with the corruption, usually the numbers are so low that it can't be used for any statistical analysis. So we decided to focus only on insiders, only on people who would actually be able to come in contact with corruption. This was quite a challenge because, of course, you cannot cover everyone in the sector. You don't know who is in touch with the sector. In some of the sectors, that was much easier. For example, we have all the names and contact details of the debt collectors or of the people who are working in this area from the point of view of the collectors. But we had no idea who the debtors were. So we had very strong database of one side of the problem, but not the other side. And that was the case in most of the sectors, that we actually had some sort of database, but only of some type of respondent, which of course was not ideal. So we spent quite a lot of time on obtaining contacts using Google, different databases. We tried to contact people to help us identify other respondents. And this was an area which I think might be actually improved to the next round of the survey, because it's really important who you actually are able to contact. We are sure.
Sorry, could I ask you something about these individuals that your team was able to identify as potential targets for the survey? Could you tell us a little bit more about the rationale behind this methodology in terms of, because the project had the support of the Ministry of Justice. How come weren't there like a full list of personnel made available to your team, for example? Other things such as when contacting them, were there issues concerning they needing permission to participate in the survey or not? Could you tell us a little more about the insight, the between the behind the scenes kind of thing about how your team went about this?
Sure. Yeah, we had a huge help of the Ministry of Justice. That was actually really important, the first stage of the project, contacting experts, because many of those experts were actually high-level people who worked at the public sector. For example, we had a judge who was actually doing, no judge, a high prosecutor who actually knew about all the cases in the healthcare sector. So he actually helped us a lot in identifying the different forms of corruption. And that was really helpful because the Ministry of Justice could endorse us. And so the experts made sure that we are legit and it's a legit project. So they were actually very open to help us. We actually didn't have anyone who would reply that they didn't want to have an interview with us. So that was a huge help. Also, the other person in the team, Radim Bureš, who is present in this call, he is very well connected to different type of respondents in the Czech Republic. So he's the head of the Czech Compliance Association, and he worked in the private and public sector on quite a high level positions. So he was also able to connect us to many people who work in the sector and who could endorse us again and make sure that the people would reply to the questionnaire. With the survey, getting people from the public sector to respond would be hard if we didn't have endorsement of the Ministry of Justice, because they are not very open to fill out questionnaire. They might be even afraid to do so. But actually, we had a huge help from them, that they actually contacted different ministries, and they told them that they have to fill out the questionnaire. So we had quite a lot of responses from them, because they were not only endorsing us, but actually helping to get responses. As I will be telling later, the responses from the public sector were actually quite easy to obtain, because we had the logo of the Ministry of Justice. So everyone was believing that the project is legit, but getting responses from the private sector was much harder for us. Maybe also because we had the endorsement of the ministry, so they might have been afraid to fill out the questionnaire because they could be afraid that the replies won't be completely anonymized.
I'm sorry, Radim, did you want to share something? I saw you unmuting yourself.
Yeah, no, I just want to say about one respondent who actually called us. We had actually more people to call us, because there was my number that they could, call if they had any questions. And there were people calling me to make sure that we won't tell anybody the things that they would fill out. And I had this one respondent who told me that he actually knows it was in the sports sector, and he told me that there's actually a huge corruption, and there's like loads of different ways to get the public money. But he doesn't want to tell me, because then we would shut it down. So he told me only over the phone, what exists and what happens, but he didn't want to fill out the questionnaire. So we also had, of course, these people who knew how it works, and they knew what to do with this, but they didn't want to fill it out. When we did an analysis of the respondents, or who filled out the questionnaire, we found out that most of them were not from the inner circle of the people who are actually involved in corruption, but most of them were a bit of outsiders, but they knew what was happening, and they were mad that something is happening. So they were open to talk a lot to us, and they wanted to fill the questionnaire because they wanted these things to stop. But getting an actual insiders, actual people who are in the inner cycle of corruption is much harder. And we had this problem mostly in the construction sector, where the endorsement was probably the lowest, and the corruption looks a bit different from the other sectors. So there are actually probably very tight circles who run the corruption market, and we had very hard time to get into this.
Radim?
Yeah, if I may add just one comment, due to the Ministry of Justice, we also have approach to some law enforcement specialists, and so we among our respondents there were a few high-level law enforcement personnel, police officers, and their view is also quite interesting. Just a small addition.
Thank you. And I would like to continue asking a little bit more about this, because I mean the project itself is very ambitious, and I think that your team has accomplished very much. And one of the things that attracts me very much about your project as well is that we normally don't get access to this type of data in a lot of projects of measuring corruption, right? Which is why normally it is divided between expert surveys or citizen surveys. We don't hear a lot about surveys conducted targeting public officials because of many issues that exactly as you mentioned them before. So I'm just very impressed about the fact that your team were able to get them to fill up these surveys, especially without, or perhaps even because your team didn't go through, let's say, the regular channel of, contacting the head of the organization, asking them to support the project, and then mandating the head mandating their employees to fill out the survey, which of course would have introduced a significant degree of bias or potential risk to the survey, right, to the data itself. The backing of the Ministry of Justice, I consider, it makes perfect sense to me that was what got your team through the door, right? Because it gave a level of legitimacy to the project itself. Could you also share a little bit about, was there any process of, let's say, either negotiation or discussion as your team was developing the methodology to get the Minister of Justice to agree to support it as a Minister of Justice without engaging formally the other organizations whose employees you were going to be surveying? Was there any questions or challenges raised by the representatives of the Minister of Justice in this sense?
Well, we were very lucky that actually the representative of the Ministry of Justice was part of the team. He is a lawyer, so he actually was able to understand quite a lot of the law part of the project. So that was really helpful that he was part of each step of the project and each step of the methodology. So he didn't feel like we are presenting something that we developed, but he was part of the developing process. And also, even before we got the research grant, we actually had loads of meetings where we were discussing what we want to do with the project, how we want to approach. So when we actually got the money, we already knew what we wanted to do. So that helped a lot. I think the biggest challenge we had was that the Ministry of Justice wanted a lot of information to get from the survey. So their idea of the questionnaire was that the questionnaire would be much longer than it's possible for the respondents. Actually, the original plan that we had was about 1.5 hours for the respondents. That was really crazy. And we had quite a hard time to discuss pros and cons and how to make sure that we would get the information the ministry needed, but we won't overload the respondents. And that was really a tough spot to select what we are going to keep and what we are going to drop out of the questionnaire. And we actually did a pilot, of course, to see what the respondents would say about the questionnaire. And that was actually very helpful because one of the doctors that we sent the questionnaire to, the long version, he told us that he thought he would die answering the question. They were so long, and he had, after 24-hour work in the hospital, and he thought that he wouldn't be even able to finish it. So at the end, we were able to shorten it. It's still quite long, but we also, I'm going to talk about that a bit later, we did a survey experiment that we shortened it a little bit more to understand what's the effect of the long questionnaire on the probability of finishing the questionnaire. So that was also a very interesting thing that we were able to do because we had quite a hard time to understand what is really needed to keep in the question. But that's also because it was a pilot. So we had loads of forms of corruption that we wanted to discuss with the respondents. But at the end, from the results we now have, we know that some of the forms could be dropped. Also, the approach we had was to ask insiders only on those forms that they actually have some experience with. So the respondents that haven't experienced any form of corruption, the questionnaire for them was for like 3 minutes, but more experience the respondent had, the longer the questionnaire was. So for some of them, it could have been even up to 1 hour.
Wow. Yeah. I have a follow-up question to that, but Radim, please.
Yeah, again, short comments. It's a very important point Kristýna just mentioned, because it was one of the first major research on corruption, and the ministry really wanted to look on every detail. So we have to a little bit oppose, but still there was too many questions. It was too much structured. So for the future research, some streamlining would be necessary. So from a methodological point of view, this was really important point in developing our research and the risk connected with it.
I have to say that I understand the let's say the motivation from the side of the ministry, because of course when you have access you get very ambitious about wanting to know more, and of course we can never know everything. Even if we had the number of questions, we don't actually have anybody that could endure that amount of time answering a survey, which invites me also to wonder, were there incentives offered for the public officials filling up the surveys?
No, we didn't have anything like that.
Okay, all right. Okay, I have many more questions, but I'll continue. I continue making them as we go through the presentation.
Sure. So our target was to get approximately 100 responses per sector. And as we knew, it's not going to be representative. We did this like big table of types of respondents in each sector, and we wanted to make sure we are going to cover everybody. So we would have answers for all types of respondents so that we know that we covered the whole sector. We were just talking about the questionnaire, so we developed the questionnaire based on the insights from the qualitative section. Originally, we thought that we would have one questionnaire for all the sectors, but we found out that's completely impossible because the forms in each sector are completely different. There's completely different corruption level, forms, and everything in each sector, so it didn't make sense at all. So we did separate questionnaire for each sectors. We had different filters. As I was saying before, we wanted to ease it to the respondents. So if some sort of respondent would not be able to encounter some specific form of corruption, we did a filter, so this form wasn't even asked to them. But still, it was a bit long. And in this part, we focused mostly on experience with individual forms of corruption. So we had some basic first questions about perception in the sector, of perception of corruption in the sector and on the whole level. But we focused mostly on the actual experience with corruption. We actually divided it to 4 types of experience. Direct, indirect, hearsay, and not heard. And we only asked people on the follow-up questions about the red flags, the reasons for corruption, the actual experience, only those who had direct or indirect experience. So if they said that just heard about this form of corruption, we didn't ask them any follow-up questions. And we focused also on reasons for corruption to find out what is wrong in the sector, why the corruption is there, and solutions, which would be helpful for the ministry to use it to do some actual legislative changes.
Could I ask you a little further about
Sure.
the selection of participants in the survey?
Sure.
And to me, it makes perfect sense. I mean, yeah, it's especially with sectors as large as this. I mean, public administrations are massive organizations, right? So 100 is not representative, but still there's a lot of good insight that you can acquire from it. As your team identified the people who would be invited to participate in the survey, could you tell us a little bit about the rate of response? That is one point that I wanted to ask quickly, but also a lot more about how your team identified, even though the point wasn't to make this a representative sample, I imagine that you wanted respondents that would cover the different areas or systems within the organization to be able to really recognize where corruption is taking place or the causes and consequences of it. Something that also I always kind of struggle with is that the division between national government and local government, and sometimes even at different levels. Because depending on the state, the public services are distributed or the mandates are arranged very differently. So do these officials represented kind of like the administration at the national level? Was there any representation from more local activities? Could you tell us something about that as well?
Yeah, that depended on the sector. So, for example, in the sports sector, we have lots of importance on the local level because the funds run from the national level, but also from the local level. So all of these levels were important. So we had to cover all of them. For construction sector or spatial planning, that was the same. It was really important also to cover the smaller local public offices that decide on the spatial planning. So that was basically done because there's a list of all the offices. So we did random selection and selected some of them that we would contact. It really depended on the sector. So the first step was that in each sector, we did a list of all the important types of respondents in the public and the private sector, and also on individual level, because in some of them, for example, in the healthcare sector, we have patients, which are basically everyone. So that was also very interesting methodological point of view, whether we also want to cover these types of respondents who would be in touch with the sector, or that would be basically everyone. So we tried to somehow identify the important types of respondents and to understand who would be able to take part in the survey. So we basically had all of these levels that would be somehow important or be insiders.
Thank you.
Which of course means that in some of them, we didn't have many respondents. For example, we have this office, National Control Office. Basically, they control everything, all the public procurement funding, but that's basically one office. So we had one respondent from this office, even though it's really important type of respondent, it's just one. So that was also an interesting thing for us, because then when we had the data, we had to make sure that we divide them by the types of respondents. For example, we had loads of doctors, but only few representative of the hospitals. So we had to make sure that all the voices have the same weight, so we don't, overweight some types of respondents. So it was in this point, it was also important to make sure that the types of respondents would be somehow logically distributed over the sample.
That's a very good point, and I can also imagine when it comes to the geographical dimension of it. As you mentioned, in some cases, such as sports or construction, local offices are quite significant. But I imagine also a big discussion was local where, because of course the country has different regions. So should it be a region that represents an average in terms of economic development, or what indicator or what characteristic do we use to select the local office, right?
Yeah. We did basically in the construction areas, we did random selection of all of them. So, but in some of them, we tried to cover all of the regions, because we know that corruption is completely different in each of the region. So we tried to do this. We also had a question in the questionnaire on the region they come from. So to make sure we cover all of them, but it wasn't representative, so it wasn't even possible, to say from this region we have, this share of respondents who would say this. It wouldn't make sense, but at least we had some, control over this.
So I know that the survey questionnaire follow up the insights from the interviews with experts. The interviews, of course, being qualitative data in nature. Did the survey also included qualitative questions?
Yeah. Wait a sec. Oh, I don't have it here. So the survey covered quantitative and qualitative questions, but this is one of my biggest outcome of the survey, is that we should focus more on the qualitative questions, because originally we weren't sure that the people would actually fill out the qualitative questions, because it takes more time. And you would also have to fill out the actual, experience you had. So we were afraid that maybe he wouldn't be so open, so that the quantitative ones are more anonymous. But it's the opposite, basically, because the quantitative ones are interesting, but they're not representative. So we could say something, but we can never do, proper statistical analysis of them. And on the other hand, the qualitative ones were, the people are filling them so much, and they were really open about their experience. We were really taken back from this. It was really interesting because they actually told us about actual experience, very detailed, and they had very interesting points on how to improve the situation, which we would never get from quantitative questions. So that was really one of my biggest things that I learned from this, that it makes sense to do this more qualitatively next time.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I made you jump towards something that you were planning to discuss at the very end. This is super interesting, and indeed, I was exactly thinking about that, about how that the low numbers make it difficult to think in terms of representation or even distribution of behavior or patterns of behavior. But then you have also qualitative data. It does sound like we have potentially a source of or people just waiting for an opportunity to share their insights and their voices, right?
Exactly. That was what I was talking about before. I think there are many people who are not happy about the situation and they want to do something with it, but they don't have the channels. They don't know, what to do. Also in the Czech Republic, we have one of the lowest share of people who actually go to someone if they hear about bribery or corruption. We just don't have whistleblowers. People don't do it. This is something probably cultural, historical, that they don't want to, seem as somehow who would go to the authorities with this. But really, people don't do it. So I think there are many people who are just not happy with the situation, and they are very open with the experience, and they just want to talk about it, and they hope that someone would do something about it. But I'm sure that this would not work in some other countries, that maybe this is some specifics in the Czech Republic, that corruption is still somehow high, but people are not happy about it. Maybe in different countries where corruption is much lower, this approach wouldn't work. So this is also something to think about.
Yeah, it is, but it is encouraging to know that there's more to the common warning of, it is going to be very difficult, or they're not going to want to share because they are enmeshed or embedded within those organizations. When it seems that the reality is very, well, at least it's context specific. Yeah. Thank you. No, this is excellent.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, another thing we were afraid of was the response rate, because of course, in some cases we had, we knew what the response rate was. For example, when we had the list of people and we sent it to them. But in some other cases, we didn't know the response rate. For example, there is no list of all the teachers in schools, but there is a list of all the heads of the schools. So our approach was to send the questionnaires to the heads and ask them to distribute it to their teachers. So we basically had no idea who distributed the questionnaires, so we didn't know what was the response rate. But among those people where we had the list and we knew what the response rate was, it was approximately between 10 and 40%. We were actually surprised that we had some types of respondents where it was 40%, because that is really high for these types of surveys. And as I said, we did combination of targeted outreach and snowball sampling in all the sectors. So in some parts of it was targeted, and some of that was that we asked somebody to send it to their list or to their subordinates. In general, we had very high interest from respondents. We got loads of calls, loads of emails to ask a bit more, to talk a bit more about their experience. It was really interesting that they actually wanted to talk to us. But of course, the response rate differed by the type of respondent. So we saw very clearly that public sector is much more open to answer the questionnaire, probably because of the endorsement of the Ministry of Justice, and the private sector that was much more difficult. We had some endorsement also in the public sector, so that helped us in some parts of the sectors, but not in all of them. As I said, the construction sector, that was a really huge problem for us. Also, we had huge problems with finding debtors, the people who are in debt, because as I was talking to different NGOs who work with them and with different colleagues who actually do research on this sector, on this part of the problem, is that these people basically they are not even on the internet, so it's much harder to reach them. So at the end, we got help from this person who is working with them and who is doing online help, who endorsed us in her Facebook group, which is of course not ideal for, scientific work, but we basically had no other option to find those type of respondents. So we even had like this type of endorsement. And we also saw that the response rate really differed by sector. For example, in education and research, so many people replied. Basically, that was the response rate of 40% was in the education and research sector. The most openly or most motivated person were people working at universities or researchers, so they were like very happy to answer. But also in this sector, there's almost no corruption, so that didn't help us much. But that was also interesting to see what are the differences between the sectors, and to see that even though we thought that education and research would be a very interesting sector, at the end, it wasn't such a huge deal in terms of corruption.
So if I may make a very short comparison, for example, when it comes to conducting online surveys of citizens, the general public, one common criticism or challenge that is thrown there is that the type of individuals who are more willing or that will tend more towards participating in the service or are of a certain kind. right? So there's already a self-selection bias implicit in that type of methodology. When you are discussing the difference in response rate between sectors, and to me, of course, as anybody that is familiar with the topic, it sounds unsurprising that people in the construction sector may be a little bit more difficult. It is usually described as being a high-risk sector when it comes to corruption. Did your team, I assume that your team discussed some interpretations in methodological terms of these differences in response rate, and what did that tell us, or how could that affect the interpretation of the data? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, that was also really important to have the third part of the project, the focus groups or the workshops, because especially in the construction sector, we found out that the problems are a bit different than what we found out from the survey, that actually the data from the construction sector are not as good as we were hoping to get. Because of the low number of respondents who wanted to fill out the questionnaire. You can see it even in this graph, we had only 116 respondents, and most of them were in the public sector. So we knew that there was something wrong. We knew that the people actually involved or who knew something about corruption didn't want to respond to the survey. So basically having the third phase of the project, the workshops, which were again filled out by experts, not the same ones, and in the first part of the project, who discussed in the group the results of the survey, was very helpful for us to understand what was going on and what were the disadvantages or the problems that we couldn't see from the survey because of the methodological problems that we of course had. As you can see from the chart, the highest number of respondents was from the education and research sector. As I said, they were very motivated to answer, but also there was a sector which was the most heterogeneous, because we had basically universities, research institutes, but we also had middle schools, elementary schools. So we tried to cover, of course, the whole sector because the ministry was interested in the whole sector. So we had to have more respondents. So that's also why we didn't stop at 100 where we could, basically because that was our target originally, but we wanted to continue to make sure that we cover everyone. We also had at the end quite a lot of respondents in the debt collection sector. We were lucky actually to get loads of people who were on the side of the debtors, but also on the other side. And that was also very interesting. This sector is basically extremely interesting in the Czech Republic because there's a systematic problem with this sector, and they try to do some big legislative changes to improve it, but there is a huge backlash from the private sector who is actually collecting the debts. So that was really interesting for us because they were actually mad at us for doing this research, and they were sending letters to the ministry that we want to do some changes. So that was really interesting. In the public procurement, the list of respondents was quite okay because it's quite transparent in the Czech Republic. So we could find out the contact details of the people who are in the tenders on the both sides. So we actually had quite a nice list. The healthcare sector, that was also quite okay because people were quite interested to fill out the questionnaire, and sport was interesting as well. Basically, sport is quite a big deal in terms of corruption in the Czech Republic because the grants in the sport are not divided ideally, and there is quite a room for corruption. So that was also interesting for us to get the respondents, and they were quite motivated to reply to the questionnaire.
I really like the point that you made in that graph about the heterogeneity of respondents based on also the heterogeneity of the sector itself, right? So because you have I don't know if I should call them different actors or different players, but certainly you have different arenas that participate in the same sector. The heterogeneity of the sector itself drove the push to go well beyond 100 across the different sectors, or even if this project was to be extended or repeated, should the heterogeneity of the sector drive the decision on what number of respondents to hit?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Because if you get 1 or 2 responses from one part of the sector, then you basically get no information. But especially in the education research, maybe the whole sector could be dropped because it's too heterogeneous and there are not so much, the problems are not so severe. So I'm not sure if it's, to do such a huge amount of work, maybe it's not, cost effective for the ministry. But some of the sectors were very homogeneous, debt collection, public procurement. They are very tight sectors where it's not such a big deal to get respondents. But again, in healthcare and sport, they're very heterogeneous, and there's a bigger challenge to get all the types of respondents that we want to. And I think it's very important to think about that when you are, when we want to, if we will replicate this research project, we need to think about this and prepare a bit more to do this. Also, another thing is that, of course, the questionnaire looks differently for the heterogeneous sectors because you need to add more filters because some types of respondents cannot encounter some forms of corruption. So you also need to think about this. Then the questionnaire is really long and really complicated, which also is not ideal for data analysis.
And the surveys were, I'm sorry if you mentioned, but I could have skipped it. Were they paper-based, online, or?
Online.
Online, okay.
Yeah.
Because I was just wondering, indeed, when there are a lot of filters, I was just imagining how complicated that would have been.
No, that would be like this. No, not possible to do it in a paper form. Also, we used Alchemer. I don't know if you know that. That's the online survey management tool, which is amazing. It's of course user friendly, but for the people who are doing the survey management, is amazing in a way that you can actually see the response rate, you can send reminders, you can even see the regional spread of the answers to the survey. So that really helped a lot with the survey management. So I spent so much time in these analytical tools that the Alchemer had. So that was really helpful. We also, originally we thought that maybe the survey could be done with the help of a survey company, but as this type of survey, not representative, would not be, some typical work they do. We decided to do it in-house, which I think really helped because we could, change the types of respondents, we could add more, we could do this experiment that I'm going to talk about. So we had loads of flexibility in conducting the survey, which helped us very much.
Thank you.
And the third part of the project were the workshops that I mentioned before. So originally it wasn't planned to be such a huge part of the project. We just thought that we would do one workshop or one focus group at the end to validate the results. But at the end, we decided to have one workshop for each sector because we found out that the differences between the sectors are so big that it wouldn't make sense to have just one workshop. And we had 6 workshops, each had about 12 experts, and we presented them the results from the qualitative and quantitative phases and discussed the results. And this helped us very much with triangulation and with understanding what the results actually mean, and what are basically, because in some of the types of or forms of corruption were very specific. So we had to make sure that we understand correctly what it's meant by that. So that was really helpful. Also, as I said, in the construction sector, which we didn't have high quality data from the survey, so that helped us enormously. Now to the main methodological challenges, which were quite big ones. So the first one is the definition of corruption, which we thought wouldn't be such a big deal, but it was a huge deal at the end, because there is different understanding of corruption, not only across sectors, but also within sectors, also across the same types of stakeholders. So as I'm gonna show you the example I have here, for example, doctors each understand the same type of behavior differently. So some of them think it's clear corruption, some of them think it's just unethical behavior, and some of them think it's completely normal behavior. So our definition of corruption wasn't based on the law definition we have in the Czech Republic, because that's very strict, and it's not flexible and doesn't cover all the behaviors the people understand as corrupt. So our approach was, in the first phase, to ask the expert what they consider as corruption behavior, what are the forms of corruption in each sector, and then based on this we did the selection, or we basically put all of the forms that existed in the questionnaire, and people were filling out the questionnaire. But for some of them, the forms of corruption that we listed were not understood as corruption. They were understood basically as normal behavior. So some of them were not happy about redefining this concrete type of behavior as corrupt, because they were feeling that we forced them to tell that they actually took part in corruption, even though they thought that they themselves were not corrupt and they didn't do any unethical behavior. So that was really interesting, how corruption is understood completely differently across the types of respondents. I just have one example here, but we had many of those. I'm not sure if this happens in all of the countries, but in the Czech Republic, there are conferences for doctors that are paid for by pharmaceutical companies. Some of these conferences are legit. They're actually, presenting new pills, new machines, but some of them are used more to somehow bribe doctors to use their specific pills to prescribe to their patients. And it's not corruption per se. They don't get, money in exchange for prescribing the pills, but they're invited to usually exotic, luxurious conferences, which are not conferences. They fly in business class. They had very luxurious hotels. And they are not forced to prescribe the pills, but it's somehow expected of them. And we basically don't know if the doctors prescribe the pills, but there is some expectation. And for some of the doctors, this was seen as normal, and for some of them, this was seen as corrupt behavior, and they don't take part in this, and they think it should be banned. So this is some of the citations we had from the questionnaire, from the more qualitative questions. One of them said that doctor's vacation was covered under the disguise of attending an international conference. We had loads of types of answers like this, that they went skiing or they went to the wine cellar and it was covered as a conference. Other one said that he said that he's taking part in these like holidays, but he doesn't think it's corruption because it does not influence his decision-making regarding patient treatment. And the other one, that was my favorite, he said that he doesn't see this corruption because he treats it with an equal approach and fairly distributes these holiday conferences among the doctors in his team. So that was really interesting for us to see how each of the type of the respondents understand this completely differently. And we had loads of feedback about this, that they were not happy about our definition of corruption. They were not happy about enforcing them to say that they take part of this and this is corruption. So that was really interesting. And we need to make sure that for the next round of the questionnaire, we somehow work with this more.
Could we stay a little bit on this topic about definition of corruption, because it is, and you said, and you presented here, it ends up being one of the most challenging aspects of measuring corruption, even if very often it just glossed over, because as we land any definition that we have on specific behaviors or activities, we end up employing some form of moral or ethical judgment, correct? So traditionally, many surveys resolve this by not employing the word corruption, for example, right? So just saying, oh, tell us about any one of these activities. Although that tends to be also to be able to assess the degree to which the respondents even understand or are aware of their own behavior as being corrupt or not, right? Which may not fit a survey that is specifically about actions and not awareness or more subjective elements. So I would love if you could tell us a little bit about the process through which your team went to kind of land the definition that you had, the operational or formal definition of corruption, into the specific behaviors in the different sectors. I know you mentioned that this was also through conversation with the experts, but as corruption ends up at the center when we deal with cases of bribery, it ends up being very clear, right? It's like the black center of corruption. But as we extend this, we end up with a lot of gray areas. And as you must at some point cut it to find the threshold so that you can identify, convert these elements into options in a survey. Where was this cutting point? How did your team resolve this?
Yeah, so just one point, based on the feedback we had, we changed a bit it, not to say that there are forms of corruption, but forms of behavior with corruption potential. But still, most people weren't happy about this either. So we have to think about different wording of this. But what we did about these to decide which forms of corruption will be included into the survey were that we had basically huge discussions about this. First, we used the literature review to find out what was done before, because for example, in healthcare, we had a previous survey in the Czech Republic. In the other sectors, we didn't have anything. So that helped us a bit to understand also what was done abroad, what are the forms abroad in corruption. The interviews with experts were basically the core things. So we tried to include many forms of corruption that they mentioned. And then we had big discussions with the ministry to select which forms would be included in the questionnaire. As I said, I think we may overdid it. So I think we had more forms that we needed to have. So we wanted to be on the safe side, not to lose anything, but some of the forms were basically redundant or For example, we had this question in the education sector. There was some corruption in the accreditation process in the Czech Republic. And there was a change in law in 2016, and the ministry was interested to find out if there was some effect of the law on the corruption in the accreditation process, which is of course very interesting. So we did 2 questions. One was before the law, and the second one was after the change of the law. But there were so few people who actually encountered any corruption in the accreditation process, because it's not very widespread corruption. So basically, this was a question that we didn't need to put it in. Basically, we didn't find anything. If we wanted to actually focus on the effect of this law, we would have to do a different type of research to focus really on the accreditation process and the effect of the law on the changes. So we had some of the forms of corruption which didn't need to be there.
Thank you.
Okay, so the second methodological challenge was the questionnaire, which I was talking about before. So we had a very long questionnaire, which we weren't sure that people would actually fill out. It wouldn't drop out in the middle, just saying, this is too long, I don't want to do it. There were, of course, many people who did this. So after discussion with different survey companies, we decided that the approach we took was to use questionnaires which were filled out by 80%. So that was our cutting point. As I said, some areas were too granular, others we found out that were missing. For example, in the public procurement sector, we focused only on the tendering process. But what we found out is that thanks to really improved transparency in this sector, the tendering process improved very much in terms of corruption. But there are much bigger problems in the actual contract implementation. That there are loads of contract changes, additional work that needs to be done, which is basically not need to be done. And we found out that there is actually more frequent corruption in this type of behavior more than during the actual tendering process. But unfortunately, the whole section on this is completely missing from our questionnaire, which is really unfortunate, but this is something that we can work on in the next phase.
I about that point, I find it so interesting because it resonates a lot with the conversation that I had with colleagues when it comes to assessing the level of corruption in procurement. And we have had a couple of presentations, at least a couple of roundtables dedicated to corruption in that sector. And indeed, a lot of the indicators and the red flags developed cover the period of or the stages of contracting, not in the implementation of the contract, right? Or maybe one element, but it just glossed over so quickly. And when we go back to a lot of the cases, for example, with the Odebrecht scandal across Latin America, a lot of the ways in which companies cheated were exactly in the way that you are describing it, is in the implementation of the contract where contracts are, budgets start ballooning, extensions, time, construction that just never finish, for example. A lot of the stuff that is not usually collected as data for that type of assessment.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that this is missing. Also, using different materials that they promised to use, missing some of the things that they promised to do. It's really interesting. We also found that there are people employed who never work on the project, and types of like this. But maybe it's because before we focused so much on the tendering process that corruption spilled more to the actual implementation, which is not yet so much covered, right? So
it is very possible indeed that it's a matter of corrupt people just finding other outlets, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And also it was really interesting for me to find out like that some of the reasons for corruption that the respondents mentioned in some of the cases were not basically corruption, that some of the, for example, in the tendering process that was present very frequently, that people were saying that it's not basically corruption, but it's more unprofessionalism of the people who are doing the tendering. So the public officials who don't understand the issue they want to tender, basically. This is very much present in, for example, tendering a new IT systems and things like that, that they basically don't understand what they want to tender. So sometimes what they do is to go to an IT company to basically write the tender for them. And then they use it. Of course, this IT company wins the tender, but the public official doesn't get any money from it. He just, you know, just his work is less complicated. So they're asking if this is actually corruption, if they're not getting any money. This is just like, you know, easing their work because they just don't understand it. So that was a different type of behavior we found out that exists in this process, which is basically not sure if that's corruption. So
were there cases where in their qualitative answers they suggested activities that your team would not classify as corrupt?
For example, we had this form of corruption, which is giving gifts to doctors. Which is a culture thing in the Czech Republic. Many people, especially the older generation, they just see it as a norm that when doctor helps you, you have to give him alcohol or, you know, eggs or money. But usually it's not about money. Usually it's about some sort of gifts. And we included this form of corruption, even though we believe it's not corruption because it's after the process, is just some culture thing, it's just sort of thank you. And we saw that about 95% of people think it's not corruption, but some of them see it as unethical behavior, something that they don't support. So they say they don't do it. Even we found out from the doctors that they basically are not very happy with this culture thing. We had a doctor saying that he doesn't drink alcohol and he has about like 100 bottles in his office and he doesn't know what to do with that. But if he tries to tell the patient that he doesn't want to receive any gift, then the patient gets basically mad and thinks that the doctor is, you know, weird, that he's trying to do something nice for him and the doctor doesn't want to receive it. So usually doctors receive it even though they, in some cases, don't want to. But I think this is somehow generational, maybe cultural, and it will slowly fade away. And I don't think it's corruption.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, we did a survey experiment that was really interesting for me because I really like doing these type of things. So as we were saying with Radim, the biggest issue we had was to decide on the length of the questionnaire. And even though the result was somehow, you know, in a middle way, I still wasn't happy with the length of the questionnaire. So I decided to do a survey experiment among two selected types of respondents. So we selected debtors and doctors because we had quite a nice list of doctors. So it was quite easy to send it to two same groups and to get the response rate and to actually control the process. And the second one was debtors because that I felt was sensitive group, which wouldn't be so happy or able to fill out such a complicated questionnaire until the end. So we had a test and control group. We sent basically the experiment was decided to be done towards the end of the project. So I already knew the results from the questionnaire. So I knew that basically the most interesting questions or answers were from the qualitative open-ended questions. So I decided to shorten the questionnaire in a way to just drop all the, or not all of them, but most of the quantitative questions, because most of them were really long and they basically didn't tell us so much information in comparison to the qualitative ones. So that was how the questionnaire was shortened. I put away most of the quantitative questions, which I thought were not so important, but I kept all the qualitative ones. So the questionnaire was much shorter, but they still had to fill out all the qualitative questions. We did 2 groups, and we sent to one of the groups, we sent the longer questionnaire, and to second one, the classical question that was sent to everyone. And we had a group which was sent the shorter questionnaire. And you see the graph with the results, and you can see that basically among doctors, the difference wasn't that huge. That basically the doctors, when they decided to start filling out the questionnaire, they in most cases finished the questionnaire, even though it was longer. But the huge difference was between the debtors. So you can see that debtors in general had higher dropouts. So 63% of doctors who started the questionnaire, they actually finished it. But among debtors, it was only 34% with a short questionnaire. But with the long questionnaire, only 10% of debtors actually finished the questionnaire. So that was a huge dropout. And I think this is a really big and important argument for shortening the questionnaire for the next round of this research. Maybe just for some types of respondents, if the ministry wants to have granular information, but this is such a huge dropout that I think this is really something we have to keep in mind. So this was the length of the questionnaire, and the last methodological challenge was the respondents recruitment, which I think we covered a lot before. What we found out that there were significant differences across sectors and types of respondents in the recruitment process, but also in the response rates. So we had high motivation among public sector citizens and NGOs. They were very happy to fill out the survey. And some of them are very knowledgeable of these types of or forms of corruption. And we have lower motivation among private companies, lawyers, and types of respondents like that. And my last slide is about next steps. We want to translate the findings, or the ministry wants to translate the findings into actual legislative changes. We have very clear views on some of the things that they need to do. We want to have further workshop with stakeholders to actually make sure that that changes would work. And we will see if the ministry is actually able to do some actual changes, because of course it's a political process. It's not just something that the ministry can do easily. And our plan is to do replication of this pilot research in about 5 years. And that's all. Thank you. And if you have any questions, just tell me, or comments, I would be very happy to hear. But I think we're also almost out of time, right?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. We have timed it all almost perfectly to the point of 90 minutes. Right now we have like 2 minutes left. So if anyone has like a burning question or comment that they would like to share, now is your chance. please go ahead. You can unmute yourself or raise your hand as well. Otherwise, well, we continue the conversation online. As hopefully all of you know, we have a page on LinkedIn and Facebook. We have groups on both platforms for measuring corruption. And there, of course, I continue updating everyone about these meetings and the recording when they go live, and also upcoming events. So I do encourage you to join. I will be sharing both the video of this presentation will be uploaded in about a month's time. And in a few weeks, I will also be sharing with specifically you who participated in today's meeting, the meeting report produced by Rezi Barash, who is here with us. Yeah, other than that, Kristýna, again, thank you so much, not just for an incredibly insightful presentation, but for a brilliant project that you and your team had carried out.
Thank you.
I would like to say that I can, thank you on behalf of the community of researchers who are trying to, push the envelope in terms of how we measure corruption. And I think that your project has tackled a lot of those issues. And normally
And opened new issues.
Yes, exactly. I mean, normally we go also in depth about the result, but I mean, because there was so much information about just how your project was carried out, that I personally was just amazed that we could have a 90-minute conversation just about how this was done. So that was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present it. It was quite a large amount of work we did with the team, so I'm really happy that we could, spread the word.
Absolutely, Radim.
Sorry that you do not plan to go to Lisbon this year, Joseph. I'm preparing myself to speak about the methodology there as well. So at least there I will continue this discussion.
Oh, well, if there is any way those sessions can be made hybrid, I'll make sure to join online at least.
All right, thanks.
And I do hope that as your team continues processing the data and getting the results and all that potentially you can be with us again in sometime later this year when the results are ready, to then focus specifically on what is the situation of corruption in the public sector, in the public sectors in the Czech Republic. I think that would be brilliant as well.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Please stay tuned for next month's Roundtable, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a lovely day.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.